Today, there are 9 confirmed nuclear-armed nations and one that famously built an entire arsenal only to completely dismantle it later on. The journey to building an atomic bomb always comes down to 2 major hurdles. First, you need the theoretical physics to design a core that can sustain an explosive chain reaction. Second, and often much harder, you need the massive industrial capacity to enrich uranium or produce weapons-grade plutonium. Back in the late 1930s, when German physicists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann accidentally discovered nuclear fission by bombarding uranium with neutrons, they realized that splitting an atom released an unthinkable amount of energy. When news of this discovery reached the United States, a group of European refugee scientists, including Leo Szilard and Albert Einstein, grew terrified that Nazi Germany would weaponize this physics first. They sent a letter directly to President Franklin Roosevelt urging the American government to take immediate action. This sparked what would become the Manhattan Project, the most expensive and secretive scientific mobilization in human history. Led militarily by General Leslie Groves and scientifically by J. Robert Oppenheimer, the project operated across hidden boomtowns like Los Alamos in New Mexico, Oak Ridge in Tennessee, and Hanford in Washington. Over 130,000 people worked on the effort, with a vast majority having no idea what they were actually building. They pursued 2 separate designs simultaneously: a gun-type device using enriched uranium-235 and a far more complex implosion design using plutonium-239. On July 16, 1945, the United States detonated the world's first nuclear device code, named Trinity, in the desert of Alamogordo. The blast released the energy equivalent of roughly 25 kilotons of TNT, instantly vaporizing the steel test tower and turning the desert sand into green glass. Just weeks later, in August, the United States dropped Little Boy on Hiroshima and Fat Man on Nagasaki, bringing an abrupt and devastating end to the Second World War. The United States believed it had secured an absolute global monopoly on atomic power that would last for at least another decade. They were completely wrong. Deep inside the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin had already greenlit a covert nuclear program back in 1942, after Soviet physicist Georgy Flyorov noticed that Western scientific journals had suddenly stopped publishing any research on nuclear physics. Stalin placed his ruthless secret police chief Lavrentiy Beria in charge of the Soviet atomic effort, with physicist Igor Kurchatov heading the science. But the Soviets had a massive secret weapon that allowed them to skip years of trial and error. Their foreign intelligence apparatus had successfully penetrated the highest levels of the Manhattan Project. Physicists like Klaus Fuchs and Ted Hall, alongside intelligence couriers like David Greenglass, funneled detailed engineering schematics and exact implosion lens calculations straight to Moscow. Fuchs had provided the precise blueprints for the American plutonium implosion bomb. Because Beria was intensely paranoid and threatened Soviet scientists with execution if the first test failed, Kurchatov built an exact replica of the American Fat Man design rather than testing an unproven Soviet variation. In August 1949, deep in the steppes of Kazakhstan at the Semipalatinsk test site, the Soviet Union successfully detonated RDS-1 code named First Lightning. American spy planes monitoring atmospheric radiation detected the fallout weeks later, sending shockwaves through Washington and officially kicking off the Cold War arms race. Across the Atlantic, the United Kingdom found itself in a frustrating dilemma. British scientists had actually pioneered much of the early atomic theory under their own wartime program called tube alloys. 2 refugee physicists working in Britain, Rudolf Peierls and Otto Frisch, had written a groundbreaking memo in 1940, proving that a small sphere of pure uranium-235 was all that was needed to create an atomic blast, making a deliverable bomb feasible. When Britain realized it lacked the industrial resources to build the bomb while fighting for survival against Nazi Germany, it agreed to merge its entire project with the American effort under the Quebec Agreement of 1943, which promised full technology sharing after the war. However, once the war ended, the United States Congress passed the McMahon Act in 1946, cutting off all foreign nations, including Britain, from accessing American nuclear research. British Prime Minister Clement Attlee felt deeply betrayed and decided that Britain had to build its own independent nuclear deterrent to retain its status as a global power and secure its own defense. British scientists led by William Penny used their first-hand knowledge from the Manhattan Project to construct their own plutonium production reactors at Windscale. In October 1952, Britain detonated its first atomic device code, named Operation Hurricane, inside the hull of a surplus naval frigate off the coast of Western Australia. By the time Britain joined the Atomic Club, the superpowers were already moving to a weapon thousands of times more catastrophic. Instead of just splitting heavy atoms, scientists realized you could fuse light hydrogen isotopes together, mimicking the thermonuclear reactions that power the sun. The United States tested the world's first true thermonuclear device, Ivy Mike, in 1952 on Enewetak Atoll, obliterating an entire island. The Soviets followed with their own deployable hydrogen bomb, RDS-37, in 1955, and Britain tested its first hydrogen bomb during Operation Grapple in 1957. Realizing that Britain had cracked the thermonuclear code, the United States finally agreed to sign the 1958 US-UK Mutual Defense Agreement, restarting their close nuclear cooperation, which continues to this day. The fourth country to enter the nuclear arena was France. During the Second World War, French scientists had worked alongside the British and Americans on heavy water and reactor designs. After the war, French President Charles de Gaulle established the Atomic Energy Commission, primarily focusing on civilian nuclear energy. But the turning point came in 1956 with the Suez Crisis. When Britain and France invaded Egypt to reclaim the Suez Canal, the Soviet Union threatened them with rocket attacks, while the United States refused to back its European allies and forced a humiliating withdrawal. For France, this was the ultimate wake-up call. De Gaulle concluded that France could never rely on the American nuclear umbrella for its ultimate survival and needed strategic autonomy. France poured vast resources into constructing its own enrichment facilities and sourcing uranium from its territories in Africa. In February 1960, France detonated its first atomic bomb code, named Gerbes Blue, in the Algerian Sahara, producing an enormous 70-kiloton explosion that immediately established France as an independent nuclear power with its own doctrine known as the force de frappe. France went on to develop its own hydrogen bomb in 1968, testing in French Polynesia and maintaining a strictly independent command structure outside NATO's integrated military framework for decades. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the fifth nuclear power was rapidly emerging amid ideological conflict. Following the Korean War and several crises in the Taiwan Strait, Mao Zedong became convinced that China was vulnerable to American nuclear blackmail. In the mid-1950s, China turned to its communist neighbor, the Soviet Union, for assistance. Nikita Khrushchev initially agreed to help, signing a secret defense agreement in 1957, where the Soviets promised to provide China with technical blueprints and even a prototype atomic bomb. However, relations between the two communist giants rapidly deteriorated. Mao openly criticized Khrushchev for seeking peaceful coexistence with the West, while Khrushchev viewed Mao's aggressive foreign policy as reckless and dangerous. By 1959, the Soviets tore up the agreement, pulled all their technical advisors out of China, and burned their blueprints before leaving. Mao responded by naming China's independent nuclear project Project 596, after the month and year June 1959, when the Soviets broke their promise. Chinese scientists, led by Western-trained physicists like Haiyan Zhusin and Deng Jiaxian, persevered through extreme hardships, including the severe economic fallout of the Great Leap Forward. They built enrichment facilities and set up a testing ground at Lop Nur in the remote desert of Xinjiang. In October 1964, China successfully detonated its first atomic bomb. Astonishingly, just 32 months later, in June 1967, China tested its first full-scale thermonuclear hydrogen bomb. To this day, China holds the world record for the fastest transition from an initial fission test to a working fusion bomb. With the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council all armed with nuclear weapons, the international community attempted to close the door on any further proliferation. In 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, was created, dividing the world into recognized nuclear weapon states and non-nuclear states that promised never to develop them in exchange for access to civilian nuclear technology. But several nations refused to sign or secretly worked around the treaty to protect their own regional survival. The 6th country to secretly build the bomb was Israel. Surrounded by hostile neighbors following its founding in 1948, Israeli leaders like David Ben-Gurion believed that a catastrophic military defeat would mean the complete destruction of the nation. They viewed a nuclear deterrent not just as a weapon of war but as the ultimate insurance policy against annihilation. Starting in the mid-1950s, Shimon Peres negotiated a secret deal with France, which was already cooperating with Israel on intelligence and conventional arms. France agreed to supply Israel with a secret heavy water research reactor and an underground plutonium extraction facility located deep in the Negev desert near the town of Dimona. The project was shrouded in total secrecy. When American spy planes spotted construction at Dimona in the early 1960s, Israeli officials claimed it was a textile plant or an agricultural research station. President John F. Kennedy grew increasingly alarmed and demanded regular inspections of the Dimona facility. Israel agreed to limited visits by American scientists but carefully staged the walkthroughs, even constructing false brick walls to conceal the elevators leading down to the underground plutonium separation plant. Following Kennedy's assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson took a more flexible approach and reached an unspoken understanding with Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir in 1969. Israel promised it would not be the first country to introduce nuclear weapons to the Middle East, while the United States agreed to stop pressing for inspections and accept Israel's policy of deliberate ambiguity. Israel has never officially confirmed or denied possessing nuclear weapons to this day. However, the reality of their arsenal was blown wide open in 1986, when Mordechai Vanunu, a former technician at the Dimona facility, smuggled out dozens of photographs and detailed documents to the British press, revealing that Israel had produced enough plutonium for an estimated 100 to 200 nuclear warheads, including advanced thermonuclear designs. Shortly after leaking the information, Vanunu was lured to Rome by an undercover Mossad agent, drugged, kidnapped, and brought back to Israel, where he served 18 years in prison. The seventh country to build nuclear weapons was India. India's program began in the late 1940s under the visionary physicist Homi Bhabha with a stated focus on peaceful nuclear energy. However, two major geopolitical shocks completely shifted India's strategic calculus. First was its decisive defeat in the 1962 Sino-Indian border war, and second was China's successful nuclear test in 1964. Indian leaders realized that their conventional military could be overwhelmed by a nuclear-armed China along their contested Himalayan frontier. India acquired a research reactor known as CIRUS from Canada, along with heavy water supplied by the United States under strict civilian peaceful use agreements. However, Indian scientists secretly diverted plutonium produced by the CIRUS reactor toward weapons research. In May 1974, during the administration of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, India conducted an underground nuclear explosion at the Pokhran test site in the Thar Desert. India officially designated the blast a peaceful nuclear explosion, code named Smiling Buddha. The international community reacted with fury. Canada severed all nuclear cooperation, and the United States spearheaded the creation of the Nuclear Suppliers Group to tightly restrict the export of nuclear materials and technology worldwide. For the next 2 decades, India maintained a policy of keeping its weapons disassembled in component form, until May 1998, when India conducted Operation Shakti, carrying out 5 underground nuclear detonations in quick succession, including a thermonuclear device, and officially declaring itself a full nuclear weapons state with a strict no-first-use doctrine. India's 1974 test triggered an immediate and frantic response from its neighbor and fierce rival, Pakistan. The two nations had already fought 3 major wars since their partition in 1947, and in 1971, Pakistan suffered a devastating defeat that resulted in the loss of East Pakistan, which became the independent nation of Bangladesh. Following India's 1974 nuclear test, Pakistani Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto famously declared that if India builds the bomb, we will eat grass or leaves, even go hungry, but we will get one of our own. Pakistan lacked the domestic industrial infrastructure to easily build plutonium reactors, so they turned to uranium enrichment through an unexpected avenue. A Pakistani metallurgist named Abdul Qadir Khan was working in the Netherlands for a subcontractor of URENCO, a European uranium enrichment consortium. Khan had access to top-secret blueprints for advanced gas centrifuges which use high-speed spinning rotors to separate uranium-235 isotopes. In 1975, Khan slipped out of Europe and returned to Pakistan, bringing the stolen centrifuge designs and extensive contact lists of European suppliers with him. Khan established the Khan Research Laboratories in Calcutta, rapidly setting up covert procurement networks across Europe to buy vacuum valves, specialized steel and electronic components without triggering export alarms. Pakistan also received crucial technical assistance from China, which reportedly provided weapons-grade, enriched uranium and blueprints for a proven warhead design in exchange for centrifuge technology. Throughout the 1980s, the United States turned a blind eye to Pakistan's advancing nuclear program because Pakistan was the essential staging ground for supporting the Afghan Mujahideen fighting against the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Just weeks after India conducted its 5 nuclear tests in May 1998, Pakistan responded by detonating 5 nuclear devices in the Ras-Kho hills of Balochistan, followed by a 6th test days later. Pakistan became the 9th nuclear power, adopting an explicit first-use doctrine designed to deter India's larger conventional military force. Years later, in 2004, AQ Khan confessed on national television that he had operated an illicit global nuclear black market network selling centrifuge technology blueprints and hardware to countries like Iran, Libya, and North Korea. The 8th country in the chronological story of nuclear weapons is perhaps the most unusual of all: South Africa. Facing intense international isolation due to its apartheid regime and fearing Soviet-backed communist expansion in neighboring Angola and Mozambique during the border war, South Africa decided in the 1970s that it needed an ultimate deterrent. Blessed with some of the world's largest natural uranium reserves, South Africa developed its own unique aerodynamic vortex enrichment process at the Pelindaba facility. In 1977, they constructed an underground test shaft in the Kalahari Desert at the Vastrap site, but Soviet spy satellites spotted the preparations and alerted the Americans, who joined Moscow in exerting massive diplomatic pressure that forced South Africa to seal the shafts. 2 years later, in September 1979, an American Vela satellite detected a distinct double flash of light in the remote southern Indian Ocean near the Prince Edward Islands. Known as the Vela incident, many defense analysts believe it was a covert joint nuclear test conducted by Israel with South African logistical support. By the late 1980s, South Africa's Armscor had successfully constructed 6 fully functional gun-type nuclear bombs small enough to be delivered by their Buccaneer strike aircraft. However, as the Cold War ended and the Soviet threat collapsed, President F.W. de Klerk realized that apartheid was coming to an end. Unwilling to leave a functional nuclear arsenal to the incoming African National Congress government, South Africa made the unprecedented decision to dismantle its entire nuclear stockpile. Between 1990 and 1991, all 6 weapons were taken apart. The enriched uranium was diluted and stored, and the manufacturing blueprints were incinerated. In 1991, South Africa signed the Non-Proliferation Treaty and invited international inspectors to verify the complete destruction of its arsenal, becoming the first and only nation to date to independently develop nuclear weapons and then completely voluntarily dismantle them. The 10th and most recent nation to join the nuclear club is North Korea. Following the devastation of the Korean War, North Korean founder Kim Il-sung sought nuclear protection from both Moscow and Beijing, but both allies repeatedly refused to help Pyongyang build weapons, though the Soviets did provide a small peaceful research reactor at Yongbyon in the 1960s. Using its own rich domestic deposits of natural uranium, North Korea spent decades slowly building indigenous gas graphite reactors capable of producing weapons-grade plutonium. In the early 1990s, as international pressure mounted, North Korea threatened to pull out of the NPT, leading to the 1994 agreed framework, where the United States promised fuel oil and civilian light water reactors in exchange for North Korea freezing its plutonium program. However, behind the scenes, North Korea had already turned to AQ Khan's Pakistani network, trading its own ballistic missile technology in exchange for uranium enrichment centrifuges. When American intelligence discovered the covert uranium track in 2002, the agreed framework collapsed. North Korea expelled international inspectors, officially withdrew from the NPT, and reprocessed its spent fuel rods into plutonium. In October 2006, North Korea carried out its first underground nuclear detonation at Punggye-ri. While the first test yielded less than 1 kiloton and was considered a partial fizzle, subsequent tests in 2009, 2013, and 2016 grew exponentially more powerful. In September 2017, North Korea detonated a massive thermonuclear device with an estimated yield exceeding 150 kilotons, proving it had mastered two-stage hydrogen bomb technology alongside intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching the mainland United States. Beyond these 10 nations, there are several countries that came remarkably close to building the bomb before reversing course. During the Cold War, countries like Sweden, Switzerland, and Yugoslavia all ran serious military nuclear programs before concluding that conventional neutrality and international treaties served their security better. In South America, rivals Brazil and Argentina engaged in a covert nuclear race throughout the 1970s and 1980s under their respective military regimes before mutually agreeing to halt their programs and establish a joint verification agency in 1991. In East Asia, both Taiwan and South Korea initiated secret nuclear weapons programs in the 1970s due to fears of American disengagement, but both programs were shut down following intense pressure and security guarantees from Washington. Then there are the cases of nations that inherited vast nuclear arsenals without building them. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, thousands of strategic and tactical nuclear warheads were left stationed on the territory of three newly independent republics: Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. Ukraine briefly held the third largest nuclear stockpile in the world with over 17 strategic warheads. Through the 1994 Budapest Memorandum, all three countries agreed to surrender every single nuclear weapon back to the Russian Federation for dismantlement in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the United States, and the United Kingdom that their borders and sovereignty would be respected. There are also instances where nuclear ambitions were halted by direct military strikes or sudden diplomatic surrenders. In 1981, Israeli fighter jets carried out Operation Opera, destroying Iraq's Osirak nuclear reactor near Baghdad before it could become operational. In 2007, Israel struck again in Operation Orchard, flattening a secret plutonium reactor being built in the Syrian desert with North Korean assistance. In 2003, following the American invasion of Iraq, Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi grew terrified of facing a similar fate and agreed to completely surrender his covert nuclear procurement network, handing over centrifuges, blueprints, and raw materials directly to the United States. Today, the nuclear map remains fiercely contested. While the total number of nuclear weapons has dropped dramatically from its Cold War peak of over 70,000 warheads down to approximately 12,500 today, every single nuclear-armed nation is currently spending hundreds of billions of dollars modernizing its arsenal with hypersonic delivery systems, stealth platforms, and miniaturized tactical warheads. At the same time, threshold states like Iran have enriched uranium to near weapons-grade purity, pushing the global non-proliferation framework to its absolute limits. From the quiet chalkboards of Los Alamos to the underground tunnels of North Korea, the story of how every country got the bomb reveals that once scientific knowledge escapes into the world, it can never truly be put back. What began as a desperate wartime sprint between world powers transformed into an enduring web of geopolitical deterrence, where humanity's greatest scientific achievement remains its most dangerous existential threat.